2-year-old James Leininger would wake up in a cold sweat, thrashing in his sheets. His screams about a burning plane weren't filled with childish fear, but with the terror of a battle relived. Plane's on fire. The little man can't get out. His parents could only watch this invisible struggle, helpless. During the day, trying to understand the cause of his nightmares, his mother, Andrea, played with him. Pointing to a part under a toy plane's wing, she said, "Look, it's a bomb." James looked at her seriously. He calmly and confidently corrected her. "That's not a bomb. That's a drop tank." Andrea and Bruce froze. They weren't in the military. They weren't aviators. They had never used that phrase. How could a 2-year-old know such a specific technical term? His father went to the computer and confirmed it. His son was absolutely right. Fantasy gave way to a verifiable fact, a fact that demanded an explanation. What explains the appearance of birthmarks on thousands of children worldwide that match the documented fatal wounds of strangers with chilling accuracy? Over 870 documented cases. It's as if an entire village wears a map of someone else's death on their skin, confirmed by medical reports. And here is a second paradox. Why do children suffering from irrational phobias, like a panic-stricken fear of water, turn out to be more accurate in their memories of a violent death? How can trauma serve not as a hindrance, but as a key to unlocking details? This is not a mystical film. This is a documentary thriller about a scientific quest. By the end of this film, you will receive 7 keys, 7 elements of a scientific protocol that allows one to separate fact from fiction in one of the greatest mysteries of consciousness. How could a child from an Indian village who had never seen a television begin to describe the life of a simple mechanic from another city? Or a boy from Louisiana recall details of a World War II dogfight? Across the globe, with no connection to one another, children tell stories that are astonishingly similar in their structure. The first explanation is obvious: childhood fantasies. Psychologists call this the phenomenon of spontaneous memories. Children mix reality, dreams, and snippets of adult conversations, creating complex fictional worlds. It would seem the mystery is solved. However, thousands of documented cases have revealed a pattern that shatters this simple picture. The vast majority of these fantasies emerge within a strictly defined age window from 2 to 5 years old, not at 9, not at 12. And just as predictably, these memories fade by the age of 7 or 8. This period coincides with what psychologists call ego formation. This presented scientists with an almost impossible task. How do you study a phenomenon that vanishes faster than it can be documented? Who do these children remember being? Kings, celebrities, heroes? Logic suggests that a child's imagination would choose vivid and appealing figures. But the statistics tell a different story. Most of the accounts are about ordinary people: farmers, soldiers, common homemakers. The idea that a child simply wants to be Cleopatra doesn't hold up to scrutiny. One disturbing detail changes the picture. About 70% of all documented cases involve a violent or sudden death, murders, accidents, combat. These are no longer charming fantasies, but stories steeped in trauma. Children who remember drowning often exhibit a panic-stricken fear of water. This phobia acts like a scar. It not only reminds of the wound, but also points precisely to the site of the impact. But if trauma is the key, how can one separate genuine memory from childhood fears developed in this life? A method was needed. How did a topic once dismissed as folklore find its way into scientific laboratories? In the 19th century, such stories were published in paranormal journals, sparking interest, but not the trust of the academic world. What made scientists take a serious look? The first attempts at systematization in the mid-20th century failed. Researchers lacked a unified methodology. The result was a collection of interesting but scientifically useless anecdotes. Everything changed in 1966 with the publication of one book, 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation, by psychiatrist Ian Stevenson. Its value lay not in the stories, but in the method. For the first time, what was presented was not just narratives, but data collected according to a single standard. The publication triggered a storm of criticism. The main argument was the lack of a protocol that could rule out deception. This storm did not break Stevenson. On the contrary, it compelled him to dedicate the next 40 years to creating such a protocol we are about to break down. So what do we have? A global phenomenon with 3 distinct characteristics: a narrow age range, widespread fading by the age of 8, and a frequent connection to violent death. This is no longer just a collection of stories, but a pattern demanding explanation. But without a strict filter to separate fact from fiction, this data remains merely a collection of mysteries. To turn them into evidence that could withstand the cross-examination of science, it took a man obsessed with order. He created a protocol that changed everything. How can you prove that a child didn't overhear an adult conversation or invent everything after the details became known? Stevenson's protocol began with a simple but ironclad rule: the complete documentation of all the child's statements before any investigation began. This created a time capsule of testimony, frozen before the heat of the investigation could distort it. But Stevenson went further. He required that the past life personality be completely unknown to the current family. Researchers deliberately sought cases where the families lived in different cities and could not have crossed paths. This filter screened out 9 out of 10 inquiries. The gold standard was to identify the deceased person based solely on the child's statements. Sometimes, you didn't even need to listen to his words for this. It was enough just to look at his body. What if the parents are simply seeking fame and coaching the child on what to say? The protocol included separate interviews with the entire family and neighbors to identify contradictions. But the reality investigators encountered was a stark contrast. In most cultures, especially in Asia, such statements from a child were considered a disgrace or a sign of mental illness. Parents actively tried to silence him. In more than half of the cases studied, they initially punished the child for his stories. Scientists had to contend not with a thirst for fame, but with a wall of fear and shame. And it was behind this wall that the most astonishing evidence was hidden, evidence that was impossible to conceal. Who was this man, Ian Stevenson, who decided to go against all scientific doctrine? A madman? A charlatan? Dr. Ian Stevenson was the chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Virginia, a part of the scientific establishment. He risked his entire career not for the sake of belief, but out of a sense of scientific duty. His principle was simple: a scientist is obligated to investigate unexplained anomalies, not pretend they don't exist. His creed was data is everything. His goal was not to prove reincarnation, but to impartially collect the facts. And the strangest, most physically tangible facts awaited him not in the children's stories, but in dusty medical archives and police reports. This protocol is not just a set of rules. It is a multi-stage filter that sifts out 99% of the noise, childhood fantasies, parental influence, and random coincidences. The cases that pass through it are no longer just stories. But what happens when something physical, something tangible, passes through this filter? Something that can be measured and photographed? Words can be faked. Memories can be false. But what do you do when a child's body carries the map of another's death? Next, we will examine the evidence written on the skin. Can a mental trauma experienced in one life leave a physical, visible mark on the body in the next? This claim contradicts all known laws of biology. Stevenson simply recorded the correlation. A child talks about dying from a gunshot to the chest and has a birthmark on his chest. It sounds like a coincidence noted by a biased researcher. But here is what his archives conceal. In a database of over 2,500 cases, 870 children were found to have birthmarks or congenital defects that corresponded to fatal wounds. This isn't just about a spot. It's about 2 spots, one smaller and one larger, that precisely replicate entry and exit bullet wounds. This presented researchers with an almost impossible task: how to prove this connection with documents. The numbers are impressive. But how do you prove that a specific birthmark isn't just a random coincidence? A forensic approach was needed. Researchers would photograph and meticulously measure the child's birthmark. Then they would begin searching for documents related to the death of the supposed previous personality. The reality was jarring when these documents were found. They were autopsy reports from medical examiners, police records, and medical charts. The evidence shifted from words to official papers. Now, a photograph of the birthmark could be superimposed onto the wound diagram from the medical report. It's like a geologist matching 2 pieces of a fractured stone. If all the lines align, they were once a single whole. In some cases, even congenital defects matched, such as a child missing finger phalanges who remembered having them chopped off. This raises a fundamental question. What mechanism could transmit information about a physical trauma from one body to another? One of the most visually striking cases involved a boy from Turkey with a severe congenital deformity on the right side of his face. Doctors could not explain the cause. But the boy had an explanation, recorded before the investigation began. He said he had been a man who was killed by a shotgun blast at close range on the right side. Based on his account, researchers found the family of a man who had died several years before the boy's birth, 500 kilometers from his village. He had indeed been killed by a shotgun blast to the head at close range. The culmination was the post-mortem photographs from the police archive, provided by the family. The photos fully corroborated both the child's story and the nature of the injuries, which were reflected on his face with terrifying accuracy. Psychology and genetics are powerless here. But sometimes children bring with them not only scars, but something entirely intangible. For example, another language. We have just reviewed some of the strongest physical evidence. Now imagine you are on Stevenson's team. You've encountered a case of a child with an unusual birthmark. What would be your next step to verify the link between the wound and the mark? Besides an autopsy report, what other evidence would you need to be definitively convinced it's not a coincidence? Perhaps witness testimony, an expert opinion from a surgeon? In the comments, list the top 3 documents you would request first. We will discuss the most interesting ideas in our community. Can a person carry on a meaningful conversation in a language they have never heard? Modern neuroscience provides an unequivocal no. Language is a skill that requires thousands of hours of immersion. But Stevenson's protocol includes element number 4, xenoglossy. Its simple form, recitative, where a person repeats memorized phrases, is easily explained by hidden memory or cryptomnesia. But there is another, much rarer form. Stevenson considered only responsive xenoglossy to be evidential when a child engages in a spontaneous dialogue, answering unexpected questions. There are only a handful of such cases in his database, less than 1%. This rarity makes them the holy grail for science. Like the case of a girl from an American family who, in a trance, held conversations in 17th century Swedish. But how could linguists be certain it wasn't a clever fabrication? Uttara Hudar, a young woman from a Marathi-speaking region of India, once woke up as a different person. She began to speak exclusively in Bengali, a language she did not know. She couldn't understand her own family. Native Bengali speakers who were invited to assess her confirmed it. She spoke a pure, authentic dialect. She knew specific culinary recipes characteristic of Bengali culture. But it wasn't just about the language. Her entire personality changed. She behaved like a mature, married Bengali woman named Sharada, demanding that her family observe unfamiliar traditions. It was a complete personality replacement. It's similar to how water changes its state. Uttara's personality didn't just learn something new. It temporarily froze and adopted an entirely foreign structure. After a few weeks, Sharada disappeared as suddenly as she had appeared. Uttara returned, remembering nothing. Why does xenoglossy, even in its most striking manifestations, remain the most controversial element of the research? The answer is one word: cryptomnesia. The hypothesis is simple. In early childhood, a person might have heard a foreign language from a nanny or on the radio. The brain recorded the information, but it was consciously forgotten. Years later, it resurfaces, creating the illusion of knowledge from nowhere. Stevenson was aware of this threat. He specifically sought cases where the language was dead or was a dialect spoken in a small village 200 years ago. It was an attempt to find a case 100% shielded from the hidden memory hypothesis. But after more than 40 years of searching, finding such a perfect case proved to be nearly impossible. In the modern world, it is almost impossible to guarantee that a child has never, anywhere, been exposed to a particular language. So xenoglossy, the most astonishing, yet the most vulnerable piece of evidence. We've seen the difference between its forms, examined the striking case of Uttara, and honestly acknowledged the strength of the main counterargument. The scientific process isn't just about collecting facts, but also about challenging alternative hypotheses. For every piece of evidence we've considered, from children's stories to scars on the body in foreign languages, scientific skepticism has its own explanation. To ignore these explanations is to engage in faith, not science. It is time to hear the other side. Next, the battle of explanations. How can thousands of cases be explained without resorting to mysticism? Science demands that we first consider the simplest, most terrestrial explanation. And there is one. A child's brain, like a sponge, absorbs fragments of information, adult conversations, television shows, illustrations, and books. This information settles into hidden memory, or cryptomnesia. Later, the brain can compile these fragments into a coherent story and present it as a personal memory. In one case, a child remembered the life of a pilot in detail. The investigation revealed that a year earlier, a documentary about this hero had aired on local TV, which the parents had on in the background. The details of the memories matched the footage from the film precisely. Hidden memory works less like an archive and more like dust in a room. We don't notice individual particles settling in our consciousness, but over time they can form a visible layer that the brain mistakes for an old memory. It was precisely to combat this trap that Stevenson's protocol was created. But cryptomnesia doesn't explain cases where the details were known to no one. But what if the source isn't the television, but the people closest to them? Skeptics argue that parents, even subconsciously, shape a child's memories. Compare two questions. What do you see? Is an open-ended question. Do you see a red plane? Is a leading question. A child, eager to please, may start to elaborate on details in response to adult expectations. This explains why the stories often become more detailed over time. However, in most cases, especially in Western cultures, the reality was the opposite. Parents weren't helping. They were trying to cure the child of his fantasies. James Leininger's father was a staunch skeptic. But parental influence cannot explain how a child comes to know specific facts that are unknown to the parents themselves. 2-year-old James called a part of the plane a drop tank. His parents, unfamiliar with the term, had to look it up in a dictionary. The information did not come from them. Why then, even with such facts, does the scientific world remain hostile? This is a battle not of facts, but of worldviews. Modern science is built on a foundation. The brain produces consciousness, just as a gland produces hormones. With the death of the brain, consciousness disappears. Period. For a scientist operating within this paradigm, the transfer of consciousness is not a hypothesis, but a category of miracle. Their skepticism is a defense of the scientific method. Carl Sagan, after reviewing Stevenson's work, said, "Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence." For skeptics, a database of 2,500 cases is not proof, but thousands of anecdotes with potential errors. The scientific paradigm acts like a fine-meshed sieve. For such a sieve, Stevenson's data are like stones. The paradigm simply discards them. Therefore, critics demand a single perfect case. The key to understanding lies in their belief that such a case cannot exist, but it does. So skeptics have 3 powerful filters. First, cryptomnesia. The information must not be publicly available. Second, parental influence. The information must not be known to the family. Third, the scientific paradigm. The data must be so irrefutable as to force a reevaluation of fundamental principles. These demands are fair. They form an ultimatum. Show us one case where a child from a family of skeptics named the name, rank, and unit number of a soldier killed in a classified operation, and whose wounds matched his birthmarks, and we will believe. The scientific community was challenged, and the answer came from a child's bedroom in Louisiana. Skeptics demand the perfect case, a case where a child names specific people, equipment, and places, where every detail is verifiable, where the parents themselves were skeptics. Right now, we will break down the case that is called exactly that. How is it that after Ian Stevenson's death in 2007, his archive of 2,500 cases didn't just become a museum exhibit? His work did not die. It continues within the walls of the University of Virginia, at the Division of Perceptual Studies. This is not an interest club. It is a scientific department that continues to verify cases worldwide. But the approach is changing. Modern researchers like Jim Tucker are searching for biomarkers of the phenomenon. 2 new frontiers of research are genetics and neuroimaging. Is there a statistical link between the DNA of the child and the deceased? Can an fMRI show a difference in brain activity when a child recalls ordinary versus past events? But these methods have yet to yield a definitive answer. We are trying to measure the immaterial with material instruments. While geneticists search for a code in DNA, other scientists are looking for a key in the very structure of the universe. Where in science might ideas that could explain the transfer of consciousness come from? Perhaps the answer may lie not in biology, but in physics. Hypotheses about non-local consciousness, or the Penrose-Hameroff theory, remain highly speculative. But they show that the idea of consciousness as a property of the universe, rather than a product of the brain, exists within the scientific field. An unexpected parallel comes from the world of artificial intelligence. Today, engineers at Google and OpenAI are tackling the problem of transferring consciousness to a non-biological substrate. The idea of separating consciousness from its hardware is becoming an engineering problem. But all these theories, both quantum and digital, remain models. And the research on children's memories, collected over more than 50 years, is empirical data. Theoretical physics and field research are like an astronomer and a farmer. One builds models of black holes, the other sees that certain clouds are always followed by rain. Do you more often trust an elegant theory or a single, irrefutable fact? How did a topic that had been gathering dust in scientific journals for decades become a subject of public discussion? What science couldn't do, television did. The turning point came with the case of James Leininger. It was a perfect storm: an American child, American Christian parents, an American World War II hero. In 2009, the book Soul Survivor about his story became a bestseller, and segments on national TV were watched by millions. But popularization is a double-edged sword. It drew attention, but it also opened a Pandora's box, spawning a wave of fraudsters and trivializing the subject. This new reality made a strict scientific protocol not just important, but indispensable. In 2 minutes, we will begin a step-by-step investigation of the most documented case in history, and you will be able to evaluate the evidence for yourself. Modern science is searching for answers in the code of DNA, in quantum fields, in digital simulations. These searches are important, but they have not yet answered the original question. At the same time, the most compelling body of data already lies in the archives. It's not formulas or graphs. It's the recorded words of a child, yellowed military reports, the tears of a fallen pilot's sister, and the diaries of a skeptical father. We are moving from discussing the phenomenon in general to examining one case that must bear the weight of all skeptical arguments. We will now open the case file of James Leininger and follow the entire path of its investigation, from the first nightmare to the final, irrefutable piece of evidence. The investigation began not with faith, but with desperate skepticism. The father, Bruce Leininger, a devout Christian, decided to prove to his 2-year-old son that his nightmares about a burning plane were just a dream. Following a psychologist's advice, he started asking open-ended questions. In response, James provided the first facts. He flew a Corsair plane, which often had flat tires, and took off from a ship called the Natoma. To Bruce, this was a set of random words. He decided to check the strangest one: Natoma. A search engine returned information about the U.S. Navy escort carrier USS Natoma Bay, which participated in the Battle of Iwo Jima. The first blow to his skepticism. Then James said that a friend named Jack Larson was on the ship with him. This was no longer just equipment. It was a name. The game was over. Bruce realized he had to find out if a pilot named Jack Larson had ever served on the USS Natoma Bay. How could a father with no experience verify a name mentioned by his son 60 years later? Bruce Leininger began a methodical, almost obsessive investigation. He found the Veterans Association for the USS Natoma Bay. He went to their reunion, spending hours poring over crew rosters. He was looking for a rebuttal, and he found the name Jack Larson on the lists. He was still alive. The culmination was a phone call. Bruce nervously introduced himself and asked the crucial question: "Did you know a pilot from your ship who was killed at Iwo Jima?" After a pause, Larson replied, "Yes, only one pilot from our squadron died there. His name was James M. Houston Jr." This was direct confirmation from a living witness. Bruce was finally convinced that his son possessed knowledge that could not be explained by any other means. But the most emotional proof was yet to come. What could be more powerful than military archives and a veteran's testimony? Family memories. Bruce found the elderly sister of the deceased pilot, Anne Barron. Her initial skepticism was understandable. For the Leiningers, it was a phenomenon. For her, it was a family tragedy. During their meeting, little James began telling her details from her brother's childhood that had never been published anywhere. He said that James had a sister named Ruth, though everyone called her Anne, her middle name. He mentioned a special portrait of James that their mother had painted. These were facts known only within the family, inaccessible to any hidden memory. For Anne Barron, this was more than proof. She accepted that the spirit of her brother lived on in this child. This elevated the story beyond a scientific debate to the level of a profound human drama. Now, let's put it all together. The case of James Leininger systematically addresses all skeptical objections. Cryptomnesia? The child knew facts that were not in the public domain. Parental influence? The father was a staunch skeptic and conducted his own investigation to disprove his son, being unfamiliar with the technical terms himself. This is a perfect storm of evidence, where all key elements converged: spontaneous memories confirmed by documents, verified by a living witness and the family of the deceased. This case poses a direct, uncomfortable question to the materialist paradigm. How do you explain this? When there are too many coincidences, they become a pattern. This case meets all the critics' demands. But what does this mean for all of us? What worldview does it paint? The purpose of this film was not to provide a ready-made answer. Its purpose was to hand you a set of 7 keys, 7 tools to unlock this mystery for yourself. The spontaneous memories of children are the raw material. Stevenson's protocol is the filter. The evidence on the body and xenoglossy are 2 independent lines of proof, physical and linguistic. The battle of explanations is a stress test for the entire system. The legacy of the research is the guarantee that the search has not stopped. And the Leininger case is the perfect example that has passed all the checks. This system of 7 keys works like human vision. 2 eyes provide a 3-dimensional picture, and the brain filters out optical illusions. It doesn't prove reincarnation, but it does irrefutably prove the existence of a real phenomenon that science cannot yet explain. And now, armed with this system, we can return to the questions posed at the very beginning. Why do birthmarks so often coincide with documented fatal wounds? The honest answer is, science does not know the exact mechanism. However, a consistent correlation in 35% of over 2,500 cases renders the hypothesis of mere coincidence statistically insignificant. We don't know how, but we see a pattern that cannot be ignored. And the second paradox: why does trauma help to remember details better? A strong emotional shock, especially at the moment of death, acts like a flash of lightning in a dark room. For a moment, it captures and imprints random details of the surroundings onto memory. Trauma becomes not a hindrance, but a catalyst for information retention. The answers to these questions do not require a belief in mysticism. They show that the phenomenon can and should be studied. We have answered the specific questions. But what about the main, fundamental question about the nature of consciousness? This phenomenon is a scientific anomaly. Such anomalies have always been the engine of progress. Observations of Mercury's orbit did not fit into Newtonian mechanics. This ultimately led to Einstein's theory of relativity. Children's memories are the orbit of Mercury for modern neuroscience. They do not disprove that the brain is the basis of consciousness in our lives, but they suggest that our understanding that consciousness is a product of the brain may be incomplete. This film does not prove reincarnation. It proves something more important. There is a real, systematic, unexplained phenomenon. To reject it is to abandon the very essence of scientific inquiry. Over half a century of systematic data collection according to a strict protocol, longer than the Human Genome Project lasted. After everything you have seen, has your perspective on what happens to consciousness after death changed? You have now followed the entire investigation. Imagine you are the head of a scientific committee with a limited grant. You can choose only one of 2 directions. Which has a better chance of a breakthrough? The first direction is the system. You invest money in collecting another 2,000 cases worldwide, conducting genetic analysis, and searching for statistical patterns. Your argument: there is strength in statistics. The second direction is the precedent. You invest all the money in an in-depth study of 1 or 2 new cases similar to Leininger's, using all available technologies, from fMRI to constant video surveillance. Your argument: the truth is proven by a single, flawless case. There is no right answer. In the comments, write just one word that reflects your strategy, system, or precedent, and let's see which approach the majority chooses.